Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Security and Technology's conversation about autonomy and AI in military systems. My name is Alice Friend. I am the Vice President for Research and Analysis here at IST, and I am joined today by Michael Horowitz, the Director of the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office at the Pentagon. The office is fairly new, and its mission is to help integrate emerging capabilities into strategy, planning, and budgets to help accelerate technology adoption at the Defense Department. Dr. Horowitz is an expert in that mission area. He is a scholar of defense innovation and the intersection of emerging technologies with global politics. He is quite simply prolific. He has published in a wide array of peer-reviewed journals and is the author of 2 books, including The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics. This is Dr. Horowitz's second tour at the Pentagon. He previously worked on force development issues in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He received his PhD in government from Harvard University and his BA in political science from Emory. And he's currently on a leave of absence from the University of Pennsylvania, where he is usually Richard Perry Professor and was the director of the Perry World House. He's also holding his finger up at me, so he's maybe asking for a pause. But while he does that, I'm just going to walk the audience through what our agenda is today. So before we dig in, Mike and I will chat for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to audience questions. This is a webinar format, so attendees had a chance to submit questions ahead of time, but you can also do so live in the chat feature. I have some wonderful help behind the scenes in the person of Sophia Morrow, our Deputy Director for Communications. She's going to help me keep track of the questions. I am seeing that we lost Dr. Horowitz for a second, so we're going to check in with our tech specialists and get right back to you. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going? I'm having really great technology time here, as you can tell, which is awesome for a conversation about autonomous weapon systems.
I should explain.
Broadly.
Yeah, I should explain to the audience. Mike is being incredibly generous, and he had a White House meeting pop up for the following hour. So he is sitting in his car somewhere on the streets of Washington, D.C., to hold this appointment with us, which we really appreciate. So Mike, knowing that your time is precious and that we are talking to you through cellular technology, I want to get us rolling here. So we're starting with the little directive that got you and I talking about having this chat. And that's the update to the Autonomy and Weapons Systems Directive for DoD. So let's start with the basics. What does that directive do? And what can you tell me about the timing for updating it?
Sure, and thanks for having me. It's a delight to be doing this, even if the technology circumstances are not optimal. DoD Directive 3000.09 is the Department of Defense's official policy on autonomy and weapon systems. It regulates the development and fielding of semi-autonomous weapon systems and autonomous weapon systems. For autonomous weapon systems, unless they meet certain exemptions, it requires a senior level review process for anybody both prior to the development, a formal development of that system, and prior to the fielding of that system. It was the first policy of its kind around the world, originally published in 2012. It's a role model for the rest of the world, and I think demonstrates the clear and strong commitment of the Department of Defense to safe, responsible, and lawful behavior when it comes to autonomy in weapon systems. Now, as to why the directive was updated now, there are a couple of reasons. And the first is the most bureaucratic reason of all, which I'm sure you will appreciate, which is that the Defense Department is such a large bureaucracy that it does not just have directives, it has a directive on directives. And the directive on directives says that every 10 years, a directive has to be either canceled, reissued, or updated. And the original Autonomy and Weapon Systems Directive was published in November 2012. Like all directives, it is in force, in place for a decade. And so as we approach the 10-year anniversary, we had a choice to either cancel the directive. That didn't seem like a good idea, given that autonomy and weapon systems remains an important topic. We could just reissue the directive, but parts of the directive seemed maybe a little bit outdated, or there are ways that we could improve them, or we could update the directive. So the choice was made to update the directive, and that went live in January 2023.
So I want to talk to you more in a little bit about this idea of responsibility in AI, especially sort of the global leadership that you're trying to foment from the Pentagon. But I do want to get a little bit into the strategic pieces of it as well, because you work for the part of the Pentagon that develops strategic level guidance generally. So I think it'd be really helpful for the audience to understand how policy about autonomous systems fits into the defense strategy for the United States. And more specifically, how do autonomous systems fit into the kind of military the US is building to achieve those strategic goals?
That's a great question. The National Defense Strategy was published less than a year ago and is the North Star for the way the Department of Defense thinks about future challenges. It outlines the People's Republic of China as the pacing challenge, that everything is directed against, essentially, or sort of toward, and lays out sort of three ways that the department seeks to achieve the goals of the strategy. The first is integrated deterrence, the second is campaigning, and the third is building enduring advantages. And as part of that, the department has made a lot of efforts, and in particular, the secretary, the deputy secretary, sort of all the way down, to emphasize increasing the speed of DoD's ability to adopt innovation, to adopt emerging capabilities, to speed the movement of technology to the battlefield, but in a safe and responsible way. And DoD Directive 3000.09 is a critical part of an overall architecture of policies. And I think it's important to emphasize, because every change we made to the directive was in response to a question, or sometimes multiple questions, that we got about the original directive. DoD Directive 3000.09 is in addition to, not a substitute for, other DoD regulations governing the development, acquisition, and use of weapon systems, and that it's essentially a supplemental safety review rather than a substitute for all the myriad of reviews that are required as part of the DoD acquisition process. And as part of the way it's thinking about the future of war, the department is interested in AI and autonomy. These are general purpose technologies that we think are having a huge impact on the character of warfare. And the department needs to be ready for what the future might bring. And part of that involves standing up new organizations like the Office of the Chief Data and AI Officer. Part of that involves doing things like creating the office that I now run, the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office. Part of that involves doing things like rolling out the responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway, which happened in mid-22. And part of that involves updating department policies, such as DoD Directive 3000.09 on autonomy and weapon systems.
So you just mentioned it, talking about autonomy these days often becomes a conversation about AI, or artificial intelligence. Just in the past few months, AI technologies have made some really big leaps in terms of search and chat, so kind of commercial tools that folks are used to. But those evolutions spell broader advancements in generative AI. Is DoD's approach to autonomy and AI robust to that pace of change? How do you keep up with that?
I think how DoD keeps up with change is a persistent challenge, and one that the department is working hard to grapple with. The department, I work in the policy part of the Pentagon, so I'm about to say something about acquisition, which it means I will probably be wrong. But the way the department has approached things like acquiring emerging capabilities, emerging technologies, has been based in a model from the end of the Cold War that involves buying down as much risk as possible before doing, any acquisition. It's I want to say laborious process that many, leaders of the department across multiple administrations have talked about. And it's one that's always made a lot of sense, but does create some challenges when it comes to trying to more rapidly adopt emerging capabilities. So the department has taken on a number of different approaches for how to deal with that in recent years. You can think about something like the Defense Innovation Unit, stood up during a late Secretary Carter's time as a defense secretary, as one example of that, in trying to bring commercial technology into the Pentagon faster. You can think about the recently announced Office of Strategic Capital, focused on more sort of investing in earlier stage companies as part of that, and trying to seed more of the future defense industrial base. You can think about organizations like AFWorks as part of that, focused on a particular service, such as the Air Force. All of these are kind of pieces of the puzzle designed to be faster at identifying particular technologies that the department views as potentially impactful. And Undersecretary Hsu, the Undersecretary of Defense for R&E, had released, I think in February 22, a list of 14 critical technology priorities. And those technology priorities really guide the way that the department focuses from an investment perspective and a speed perspective. And one of those is trusted AI and autonomy. And that is, I think everybody recognizes, will play a critical role in the future of warfare, even if there are disagreements. And I not mean to say that there are disagreements, but even though, if you look at, say, like the broader literature out there, even if there are discussions about, what exactly you could use AI for, what exactly you could use an autonomous system for, et cetera, there's, I think, broad agreement, especially in light of what's become more public over the last few years. I mean, not just ChatGPT, but lots of advances in AI, that there are real capabilities coming online, mostly driven by the commercial sector, that we think could have a substantial impact. And so the department's always looking at ways to take advantage of those.
Well, let's talk about AI safety and responsible AI in that case. This directive 3000.09 incorporates DoD's responsible AI strategy and the pathways that you referenced. You also recently helped unveil the US government's proposed international framework on the responsible military use of AI and autonomy. Can you talk us through these frameworks in a little more detail? Help us understand particularly how DoD is thinking about the principled use and development of AI in the military context.
Yeah, well, let me start with the DoD piece, and then I'll switch to the international piece. And this gets back to what kinds of changes the department made in Directive 3000.09 in the update. And those updates reflected there are a few different types of updates. The first were process or bureaucratic updates. So those were updates that where things in 2012 just didn't exist anymore. For example, the AT&L organization is now R&E and A&S. Or, for example, to get to the specifics of your question, when the original Autonomy and Weapon Systems Directive was published, DoD didn't have ethical AI principles, and DoD didn't have a responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway. And so the revised directive makes clear that if an autonomous weapon system was to have AI-enabled capabilities, that those would need to follow those DoD AI guidelines. Let me take a slight tangent here to say the largest single change we made in the directive, for anybody that's curious, was cleaning up language. And cleaning up language to make it clearer what the directive said and didn't say. And that there are people that over the years, both inside and outside the department, that described DoD Directive 3000.09 as prohibiting autonomous weapon systems, which was untrue. There were also people that described the DoD Directive 3000.09 as essentially a pathway for autonomous weapon systems, and believe the department is, like shepherding, like their autonomous weapons, systems in the basement or something. And sorry, anyone that's been to the Pentagon knows that's a joke. And the challenge here is then in cleaning up that language to make it more obvious, both inside and outside the building, what the directive was sort of actually about. Now, the responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway is new, just like the CDAO organization is new. And it lays out essentially steps that organizations should take to ensure that systems meet the requirements laid out in DoD's ethical AI principles, that they're traceable, governable, et cetera, with using sort of examples and best practices, and there are actually a lot more coming from CDAO on that front when it comes to implementation guidance, to try to ensure that whatever the department does, it does it in a safe and responsible manner. And that's actually a good transition to saying a little something about the declaration that the US government unveiled last week. In that the Department of Defense, as the update to this directive suggests, has been at this question of AI and autonomy for a while. In that we've been working on policy issues surrounding these topics for so long that we've now been forced by the department to update those policies. And we have an AI strategy, the responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway, a ethical AI principles, the Directive 3000.09, and the unclassified nuclear posture review, which commits the United States to human involvement surrounding critical decisions involving the use of the potential employment of nuclear weapons. All of those from the perspective of the Department of Defense are, one, they're public. You can access all of those things, the Department of Defense's website, in some detail. DoD, in many ways, has some of the most detailed and transparent policies surrounding AI and autonomy in the world, including many companies. Most countries haven't published, this level of detail. Most companies wouldn't, because they wouldn't want to compromise that kind of information for perfectly reasonable corporate reasons. Not that I know anything about the corporate world, but no, I actually don't. But the Department of Defense has been at this for a while and believes that even if one doesn't agree with every aspect of DoD policy, it's really well thought out and pretty detailed in a way that we believe can help create strong norms for responsible behavior. So what do we want at the end of the day? We want AI and autonomous systems that are safe, meaning they work, that can be employed responsibly, with commanders and operators exercising appropriate human judgment, especially when it comes to weapon systems, and that can be used in ways that follow the law of war, international humanitarian law, and other commitments of that sort. And we believe that these policies together then can come together to highlight what is possible for the world and be the basis for international cooperation. So we had some discussions with other countries, with other actors in the lead up to the REAIM summit last week in the Netherlands, and proposed at that summit. It was Undersecretary Jenkins from the State Department, a true example, I'm not kidding at all this time, about a true example of interagency cooperation, announced the proposed declaration on responsible sort of military use of AI and autonomy. And our goal is to work with allies, partners, other states in the coming weeks and months to bring lots of actors on board to send a strong signal and create a strong norm about responsible behavior.
So you mentioned several things there that I want to jump on. One was the idea of command and control, and then you talked about the nuclear space in particular, and I want to tackle those one at a time. there's this concept of human machine teaming when it comes to autonomous systems. But when we think about that, we often think about the machine side and not the human side as much. So when we're thinking about the humans that are involved in command and control for these autonomous systems, who are we talking about? Who are they? Where are they? What kind of power do they have over machines? And then how involved are those humans in higher level decision making? In other words, the decision support element of things.
No, that's a great point. And I think human machine teaming is the right way to frame the department's approach to a lot of these topics. And that's because, DoD believes, and I think that this is true, that the American military is the best in the world. And we have incredibly highly trained, highly educated, soldiers that are capable of almost anything. And we want to use advances in technology to enable them, to help them achieve the goals of the joint force, uphold the national defense strategy, et cetera. And this is something that is, and I would say as a side note, this is something that differs a little bit from some of the competitors of the United States, who tend to think about AI and autonomy more from a control perspective, who tend to be more opaque in the policies that they have surrounding AI and autonomy. And it's something that we think differentiates the United States. And one reason why we believe that many countries will be willing to and interested in coming on board with the declaration. But to the specific sort of question that you asked about command and control, when it comes to autonomous weapon systems in particular, what the department has always outlined, and this was the same from the original directive to the revised version, is this notion of appropriate human judgment and of commanders and operators having knowledge about how systems work and how systems operate, so that they can then make the same kinds of educated decisions about the use of force that they make with non-autonomous systems. Since at the end of the day, and this is a military effectiveness question as well as potentially a law of war question, and that at the end of the day, you could have the most exquisite system in the world, but there's loads of academic research that shows that if commanders and operators don't trust that system, they become less likely to use that system. And so embedding that into the autonomous weapon system policy, or I guess into the autonomy in weapon system policy, is important from the perspective of the department, and reflects the fact that the commitment to responsibility and accountability when it comes to autonomy in weapon systems doesn't change from other kinds of weapon systems. And just because the goal essentially is the same degree of accountability and responsibility for the use of force, whether what you were talking about is a commander ordering a unit into battle, or some sort of human machine team that's involved in an operation in one way or another, is that reflects the commitments that the United States has made from a law of war perspective. It also reflects the commitments that the United States has made based on its understanding of the best way to design and conduct military operations.
So I think the place where a lot of these kinds of decisions feel the most acute is in the nuclear space, right? So you mentioned the nuclear posture review earlier. One of the elements of the responsible military use of AI framework that you've been referencing says that government should maintain human control over, quote, sovereign decisions concerning nuclear weapons employment. So again, sort of raises that decision support question. At IST, we're about to release a study we did in partnership with Sandia National Labs about the integration of AI into nuclear command and control systems. So can you speak to norms about AI in particular when it comes to nuclear command and control, maybe a little bit about sort of efforts towards confidence building that we're trying to do, considering that this is sort of a new area of concern for the international community?
Yeah, absolutely. And really looking forward to reading that study. The department for years, there have been messages from senior leaders making clear the commitment of the Department of Defense to human involvement in decisions about the employment of nuclear weapons. There were combatant commander statements several years ago. Retired General Shanahan, the first director of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, made a statement to that effect a couple of years ago, but it was never written down in DoD in a public DoD policy anywhere. It simply reflected a widely held belief within the department about the critical role that humans should play in command and control surrounding nuclear weapons. So the Unclassified Nuclear Posture Review, which was released at the same time as the Unclassified National Defense Strategy, takes that commitment, which we all knew existed already, and puts it in writing for the first time, making it clear that this is the policy of the Department of Defense. In addition, over the summer, during NPT and other sort of nuclear nonproliferation discussions, the U.S., UK, and France, that the P3 released a statement to that effect. As part of the P3 statement over the summer, one of those items was this notion of human involvement over critical decisions surrounding the employment of nuclear weapons. And the language in the AI declaration mirrors that from that publicly available P3 statement over the summer, in part signaling the, I think, desire, interest of the United States in working with, allies, partners, lots of countries to create these responsible norms of behavior. As we know from the Cold War that confidence building measures, can succeed even during periods of tension, and especially are likely to succeed when they're based in shared interests. And increasing safety, reducing the risk of inadvertent conflict, reducing the risk of accidental escalation is something that just about every country should be able to get behind, and certainly in the nuclear realm. And so as we worked toward the launch of the AI declaration, or the AI and Autonomy declaration, we wanted to ensure that there was a strong statement there about a commitment that the United States has already made unilaterally, and that the P3 have already made, surrounding human involvement in decisions involving nuclear weapons.
Well, Mike, knowing that your time is compressed, I want to turn to the audience questions before we lose you here. So for about 15 minutes, I've got a few more questions for you if you're game.
Absolutely.
All right. So the first question I've got here is about data governance challenges. So the questioner asks sort of what data governance challenges do you foresee in evaluating the performance and accuracy of autonomous weapons systems deployed for use outside the US, so in operational circumstances?
So I think there are a lot. I would put this into two buckets. The first are the data challenges that the department deals with in general, and the second are data challenges surrounding operations in particular. And this administration has been very clear, actually, about the importance of data, and you see that in the transition that led to the standing up of CDAO, the combining of the Defense Digital Service, the Office of the Chief Data Officer, and the JAIC. Note that in CDAO, data comes before AI. That's because data is the foundation. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, published, signed out a data directive, I think about a year and a half ago, making clear the need for the department to share data with itself. Since, often in the interest of security, for good reasons, for security reasons, you have, all these different data systems with, that are stovepiped. And I think one of the biggest and most important things that CDAO is doing is trying to implement that data directive from the Deputy Secretary of Defense and bring the department's data together in a clearer, more accessible, more governable, frankly, way. Now, when it comes to data and the use of when it comes to evaluating, systems on the battlefield, the department's always gathering data about weapon systems. And if you look at DoD Directive 3000.09 and the way that the testing and evaluation requirements are written, prior to a system being approved for deployment, it needs to go through a rigorous senior review process with approval from the Undersecretary of Acquisition and Sustainment, the Undersecretary for Policy, and the Vice Chief. And that all of them need to approve and approve that that a system has demonstrated the ability to perform accurately and safely, using an approved lawful concept of operation. Employing and even lays out, I believe in section 3, the testing and evaluation requirements and the number of folks that would need to sign off on that, which are pretty rigorous. Since the last thing the department would want is a system that where there were data governability issues surrounding a deployed autonomous weapon system, not just for not for anything particular, and not for any reason more than weapons that aren't safe don't work, and nobody wants their weapon systems to work more than the Department of Defense. And so following the guidelines in 3000.09 is what helps ensure that any autonomous weapon systems will be governable in a way that will make them useful.
I've got a maybe slightly tougher one here for you. Is the DoD concerned that the rapid private sector advances in AI will level the technological edge the US has over other countries in this space?
It's a great question. And with my, when I'm not working for the Defense Department hat on, I've written on this issue. Several times. I think that the technological advances that come from the private sector can be challenging, but almost everything we know about the relationship between technology and military power suggests that it's less about the specific technologies, usually at the end of the day, and more about how militaries make choices about how to scale them, how to employ them, how to design doctrine, how to use them. And so it's not necessarily true that technological advances coming from the private sector, has to represent is necessarily a bad thing for the United States. It's a different thing than the world where it was defense investments driving, really driving innovation. And to be clear, there's still a lot of that going on today. But there's still a huge ability for the department to leverage those technology advances effectively in ways that sustain or even deepen at times the edge of the joint force.
Okay, I've got a fun one for you. Was any part of the drafting of the directive AI assisted?
I'm going to say any part of the directive that you think if you read it, you think is unclear, was definitely written by ChatGPT and not by a person. I would say jokes aside, the answer to that question is no. I would say my personal belief, this is obviously not a coordinated Department of Defense opinion, is that there are lots of tools that if you're working with something that you could run through ChatGPT, which would generally not be most Defense Department documents prior to publication. The one utility for ChatGPT might be, could be feeding it paragraphs and asking it to summarize it and seeing whether ChatGPT thinks it says what you think it says. But that is not something that we did with the directive.
Yeah, an unofficial position, I'm sure.
That is definitively an unofficial position. And also, please follow, if anybody here works for the government, please follow all rules and regulations.
Obviously. So on a more serious note, we have a question that asks you to elaborate further on the difference for DoD between human control and human judgment. Do you have any specific concerns about the difference between control and judgment?
That's a really good question, and it reflects a difference in some of the international conversation about autonomous weapon systems, and that the department has favored this, this phrase about appropriate human judgment, and is not generally embraced the language of control. And whereas many in the international community from civil society, you see this in some of the UN laws, GG conversations. There's this phrase, meaningful human control. And I think control from the perspective of the department reflects it's not, in some ways, it's not clear what exactly control means. And there's been concern, I think, in some quarters that control implies a degree of regulation over the sort of micro processes surrounding the use of force that is not sort of held for any other kind of weapon system, any other kind of use of force. What we want when decisions to use force are made is that decision is lawful, that commanders and operators can have visibility on what's happening, understand what the likely consequences are going to be, go through that whole approval process surrounding the employment of force. And that should be true of any autonomous weapon system as well. And so this is essentially a continuation of the way the department thinks about the use of force and its commitment to the law of war more broadly, whereas that language of control in some ways is less clear, what that would mean.
So the next question, I think, touches a little bit on these ideas of AI achieving sentience. It says, what is your perspective on growing concerns about power seeking and other risky behaviors from large frontier AI systems? Which of course isn't anything that DoD has at the moment, but it is a sort of advanced future technology concept that's important to think through, now as opposed to when it's too late, right?
So I think, one of I feel like one of the most profound moments in every movie where things go south with some sort of AI system is the moment where the humans try to unplug it and it won't unplug. What's going to happen then? I think I would say if you look at department policy has tended to focus on applications of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems that are sort of coming, that are coming sort of downstream, that are, not necessarily near term, but that are, sort of one could imagine sort of happening, and where the department is, seeks to develop policy to, to govern what development might look like in those cases. And I think that that's a responsible approach that the department should take. There's a lot of speculation out there about what artificial general intelligence might look like, what a transformational artificial intelligence capabilities might look like. A challenge, and this is with my personal hat on more than, this is certainly not a Defense Department position, is that those conversations can get non-falsifiable pretty quickly. And that, almost anything you would do in response to the challenge of some sort of AGI, one could then respond, well, the AGI would know you were going to do that, or would have lots of data and would be able to handle that. And so it can actually be hard to have, I think, detailed strategic conversations about what to do in that world. So there are plenty of strategic conversations about what you do to shape whether that world happens and what you do to help ensure that world is responsible. But it's actually been, I think, kind of challenging if you look at the literature to have sort of detailed strategic conversations about what happens after, because of some of that non-falsifiability problem. And it's so, it may be because our brains are just not big enough to fundamentally understand. It's a great question though.
Yeah. Harkening back to what we were talking about earlier, somebody wrote, if an AI does a thing, who is held accountable? The programmer, the user operator, or the commander? Where can an average person read this doctrine, or can we? So I can answer that last question. Yes, you can find it. It's on the DoD website. But the accountability question is really interesting, and I think gets us back to that human in the loop conversation, right? Who's sort of responsible for what an AI system does?
Absolutely. And the directive does not have a requirement that a human be in the loop for the use of for the use of force. It requires appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force, and by that the same accountability mechanisms that would apply to a fighter pilot, that say a fighter pilot fired a missile and that missile caused some sort of collateral damage, and there were accountability questions, there'd be lots of questions. You'd wonder, did the missile malfunction? Did the fighter pilot mean to fire that missile, at that target? If they did, Were they doing that on orders, or were they sort of acting in a rogue fashion? You know, they're also, you could sort of go down the line, and what that ends up going back to at the end of the day is accountability at the point of a commander that's making a decision about the use of force. And the same thing would be true for same thing is true as the directive makes clear for semi-autonomous and any potential autonomous weapon systems. So if there was a malfunction, just like if there was a malfunction in a missile, if there was a malfunction in some sort of autonomous system where it was clear that, according to sort of law and regulation that are broader than this category, that say a manufacturer be accountable, then the manufacturer be accountable, just like they would be accountable in any other situation. If it, so the accountability rules, or I guess this is I'm sorry, I'm winding my way toward essentially saying the TLDR here is that the accountability for the use of force is accountability for the use of force from the perspective of the Department of Defense. It doesn't matter whether it's an autonomous weapon system, a semi-autonomous weapon system, or a weapon system with no degree of autonomy. And the department believes that the existing law of war, existing international humanitarian law, existing DoD regulations, all of which are available on the department's website, are sufficient to cover that situation.
So I'm going to push you a little bit on that, because it sounds like, for law of war concerns, if and somebody else asked a related question about sort of targeting and errant strikes is one question. So, if there are civilian casualties that are part of a strike that comes from an AI system, we don't hold probably the AI system itself accountable, right? There is a human at some point in the chain of command who would be the responsible party.
Right, just like with a non-AI enabled use of force, there would be a human operator or commander that would be making a decision about the employment of a weapon system, about the start of an operation, or maybe that is on the loop sort of with that system. And those individuals would be, would like the, accountability. We don't need to make this essentially more complicated than it needs to be. And the department has very detailed accountability, conversations all the time. And it doesn't need to be different, I think, for autonomous weapon systems or semi-autonomous weapon systems, except that, to the extent that maybe there's some additional layer of software, maybe there are additional questions to decide about when you decide that something is an accident versus not an when does something a design flaw versus a malfunction. But again, those kinds of questions the department deals with were non-semi-autonomous, non-autonomous weapon systems all the time. And so has a lot of experience in managing those issues.
Yeah, and gets back to your point earlier about how critically important it is to the DoD that these systems work the way they are designed to work, and why you want good data going into them, so it's not garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly.
So I'm mindful of your time. I have one last question for you, which is, what's next for you guys? What should we all get excited about learning about next?
Well, I would say, given that we just released the AI declaration last week, I hope that people are still excited about that. And I think that there's a lot of hard work to do in working with with the State Department, with and with other countries in fine tuning these these strong norms that come out of a department policy to create. What we hope is the first, it's a non-binding political declaration, but that represents the first, at least sort of could be the first ad hoc international agreement, on the topic of sort of military AI and autonomy broadly, and that illustrates the department's commitment, again, to safe and responsible and lawful behavior.
Well, Mike, Dr. Horowitz, again, we're so grateful for your time. Thank you for squeezing us in between all your meetings. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. Please check us out on LinkedIn, on social media. We're at securityandtechnology.org. I'm Alice Friend. This is Dr. Mike Horowitz from the Pentagon. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Horowitz.
Thanks so much. And sorry again for doing this from my car.
No worries. Semper Gumby.